The act of moving onward means we pass these signposts. One of them was first leaving Earth. The next one is hanging out on the moon. What's next? The planets. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world. This fragile little world. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world.
Hello and welcome to Voices from L5, the podcast all about the other side of space settlement. Today we have Micheal Laine, president of Liftport Group. Kind of a big name in space stuff with all of you, and I'm sure it rings a lot of bells with all of you out there. Hey Micheal, how you doing?
Hey, good to be here. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So you are president of the Liftport Group, as I said. You kind of been around a little bit, seen a lot of different elements of both space settlement and just general space enthusiast, space entrepreneur groups. It's kind of interesting to have you here on the show. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of interesting comments on this one.
Sure.
It's great to have you here. I guess the obvious first question that springs to mind to get this all started is, what's Liftport up to right now? You guys were pretty big and were making some really interesting noises a couple of years ago. And then things went a little bit quiet, but you guys are coming back, basically, doing some really interesting stuff.
Well, yeah. We started out as I started out as part of a NASA Institute for Advanced Concepts research team. I was the second guy on the project when NASA wanted to investigate the idea of building a space elevator. And that was, that kind of changed everything for me, really. I came on the team as kind of a little bit of a skeptic, and then over time I was convinced that it was in fact near-term technology. That was back in 2001, so the middle of 2015, it looks less near-term than it used to.
Right.
But we started working on the concept and development of a space elevator, and a lot of people then and a lot of people now still consider it to be science fiction technology. But I think that we're surprisingly close to a technology that could revolutionize all things about space.
And see, some of my listeners out there, or anyone who's following me on Twitter, will probably already know that I probably list myself amongst the skeptics as far as space elevators go.
Sure.
It's not that I don't see it being possible, just that I'm not entirely sure if it is as near term as some people say it is. And I think there's still some interesting research coming out of that area, and every couple of years or every couple of months even, we hear someone somewhere come out with something interesting to say about it. And certainly the concept, would revolutionize space if it was going to happen. But it's just never been one of those things that I see as in the pipeline. So in a lot of ways, it's interesting to have you on here. Maybe we can get my mind changed a little bit.
Well, the way I look at it is that, so I think that the technology, the theory is solid, the math works, but where we're stuck, of course, is the materials are not available. So let's back up and make sure everybody's on the same page. The Earth-based space elevators looks like this. You have a ball on a string, spinning it over your head. The string in the middle stays straight. So now, instead of a simple toy, let's expand it, let's enlarge it to a huge system, an Earth-sized system. So the Earth is spinning at 1,005 miles an hour. You have a very long, very strong string attached from the Earth out to a man-made satellite. That's the ball on the string. The Earth is still spinning. The string will stay straight. So basically you're balancing centrifugal acceleration from the pull of the satellite out, the pull of the string down. The string stays straight. Once you have it, you can literally build yourself a ladder to climb back and face on.
Right.
Now, that idea has been around for over 100 years. Some people think that it originated from, well, let me rephrase that. Everybody knows that Tsiolkovsky invented it, but they think, popular legend is that he was getting inspiration from the idea of building the Eiffel Tower. Perhaps he saw an article and started imagining how high can you build, and there we have the elevator. But it wasn't until the NASA NIAC study that people started taking this thing seriously. I had read about it in popular fiction several times. The idea has been around for a while, but nobody really thought it was real. So here, Dr. Brad Edwards shows up and invites me to be a part of his team. And all of a sudden, I'm starting to see, like, wow, this thing is really pretty neat. And there's breakthroughs in carbon nanotube technology. That's what ultimately the string was probably going to be made out of. But there's breakthroughs in carbon nanotube technology every day, practically. I mean, certainly there's a major breakthrough about once every 4 months or 6 months. But there's steady incremental progress. And as that technology gets closer, the elevator becomes more and more possible. So our argument to NASA back in, I guess, 2002 and 2003 was, let's do the hard work of the research now, and the materials will take care of themselves. Because frankly, once you build that kind of carbon nanotube structure, the elevator is just going to be a footnote in history. We're going to have a fundamental revolution in material sciences, and the elevator is just going to be one story out of many based on the revolutions that these new materials provide.
Right.
So Edwards made kind of well, in hindsight, it's kind of a mistake. It didn't feel like that at the time. By going out and publicly saying we could build the elevator in 15 years. Liftport, our company that we created after the NIAC project closed, we were actually so bold to put a countdown clock on our website saying that it might be done by 2018. Well, fast forward to where we are now, that's obviously been a mistake. But at the time, back in 2003, it really did look a lot closer than anybody. It looked pretty close. It looked pretty close.
And that's often the case with all these technologies too. I mean, bring back to the settlement angle of this. I mean, O'Neill, in his research and in his papers and in his book, sort of thought that space settlement was just right around the corner, and I'm sure coming right out of Apollo, that seemed like a very, very, very likely scenario.
Sure. Well, it's not just, we didn't just have technical problems, right? So my team, we did some work with MIT and the National Renewable Energy Lab out in Colorado. And we thought we were kind of merging two very likely technologies. It looked like each one of those teams had parts of the solution, and we tried merging their tech, and frankly, we were awful at it. I mean, we sunk something north of $300,000 into that research, probably close to about 225,000 or so. I misspoke. But yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, we had no reproducibility. It turns out we had some pretty major errors in our philosophies in how we were approaching the problem. So, we made mistakes, everybody else made mistakes. But interestingly, to me, it has become difficult to get a PhD in the mechanical properties of carbon nanotubes because there is so much emphasis on the electrical properties. So here you have a scenario where IBM and Intel are putting billions of dollars into CNT research because they realize that the silicon chip is right at the edge of its useful life, and our whole global economies are based off of Moore's law, and that computers are getting faster and stronger and cheaper, but they're coming up against the atomic edge of silicon chips. So there's consideration that maybe we'll move to carbon nanotubes as maybe the next base layer for computing chips. Well, so they're putting all their money into the electrical properties. If you want to get a PhD in carbon nanotubes, you almost are forced by necessity to focus on the electrical properties. The National Nanotech Initiative is the same thing. So even though we have the promise of a material that is conceivably 30 to 50 times stronger than industrial steel, nobody's putting the emphasis on it. The money isn't there to do the research. So that's been one of those things where, when we were making predictions in 2003, we assumed that we would have a global community focusing on the mechanical properties of CNT. Well, that just simply hasn't happened yet.
Why do you think that is?
Well, one of the things that I like about your show, Liam, is that you're not just focusing on the technology behind space settlement. So I'm going to take that same mindset and say it's not just about the technology. It's about politics and money and patentability and international partners. And we're just talking about getting a breakthrough in carbon nanotubes, right? But you've got, everybody focuses on the strength problem, but it's length, strength, alignment, chirality, mass production, and functionalization. Those are actually 6 different problems of carbon nanotubes. And each one are starting to fall, but different nations are approaching the problems in different ways. Different groups, different universities especially, but some commercial groups are approaching each of those 6 problems from a different perspective. So, I feel like all of those problems will eventually fall. There's a lot of brain cells working on these problems, but it makes a functional Earth elevator seem very, very distant. Right. I would not, at this point, I've been asked several times, when is this thing going to get built? And I actually shy away from that question now because it's a whole lot more challenging than just solving one material science problem.
Right. It often is the case with most of this technology that we're talking about, space settlement and nanotubes and a lot of this futurism tech that we talk about so often. The issue is often not just one question, but a million of them, and it's always interesting to try to backtrack and find out exactly what is holding these things up, and you inevitably end up with this sort of octopus with its tendrils in every single facet of life. It's not just inventing carbon nanotubes. You've also got to get someone somewhere to build the carbon nanotubes, and then you run into the problem of finding out how to build a bunch of carbon nanotubes and building them the right way.
You're missing the first step, which is how do you pay for the research to do all these things?
Well, exactly. It's not even worth saying because it's so ubiquitous as an issue for all of this technology. I just find it interesting that we have these methods and ways and technologies and research in so many different fields that I feel are revolutionary and could fix so many of the problems that we have, and yet we still run into so many issues with it. And, you know, it's interesting to have that come from an entirely different field than space settlement, because it's the same problem I think a lot of people who were invested in space settlement run into, of where is it and why isn't anyone paying for it? The answers are often a lot more mundane or mundane, I suppose, would be the word, than we expect. It boils down to something like politics or straight up, you know, investment models that aren't really built for the technology that we're talking about.
Peter Thiel is kind of famous for, so Peter Thiel is one of the PayPal mafia billionaires. And he's invested in lots and lots and lots of stuff, notably Facebook and some others. But he's got this breakaway group that's trying to do kind of outlandish technology. And his quote is, "We wanted flying cars, but we got 140 characters." And what that means is it's really easy to invest in what I call ones and zeros companies, whether it's .coms for the late 90s, early 2000s to web apps and phone apps now. It's really easy to invest in those kinds of companies because, let's face it, it's, you know, $250,000, $500,000 will put together a small team to develop a minimal viable product that is marketable in a matter of months, 5 months, 6 months, and you can have a real application that does real stuff. And 4 years later, $1 billion. Right? So that's a pretty good ROI. And it's not just once. I mean, the idea of unicorns in Silicon Valley is reasonably common. I mean, people make those ideas. Whereas if you are trying to do nanotech research or computing or robotics, or the hard stuff, the stuff that's more about atoms than bits, then you're talking about a $500,000 might be a single piece of equipment. I mean, one microscope costs that, right? Not somebody to work microscope, not somebody to produce anything, not the special environment that the micro live in. All of those are additional expenses. You just have one microscope, one piece of equipment. So, I mean, I can understand why the Silicon Valley VCs focus on ones and they have a better chance at a higher return on investment.
Right.
So there's a very established capital path that leads from a dorm room at Stanford to going public. And it starts, a couple students working together late nights, somebody throws them pizza money. Then they get their friends and family involved, and then their friends and family, and that ecosystem especially is finding an angel to get them a little further, and then that angel wants to cash out, so they've got a VC in their pocket that they work with. That VC gets them a lot further. Maybe they get to an incubator stage, and eventually they get bought by a big company, or they sell at Wall Street. That capital path can happen in 18 months from idea to sale. I mean, that doesn't happen in the space community or the hardware community or the solar panel or robotics or advanced computing. I mean, that doesn't happen for our community. So, yeah, finding capital for these big ideas is very, very challenging.
Yeah. You're touching upon a little bit there of this philosophical difference that I think people want and people end up going for. The quote that you started that off with sort of encapsulates it, but with it being so much easier to invest in these other ideas, these sort of faster turns to profit, I don't, we're going to need to wait. In my mind, we're going to need to wait until that system in some way changes or develops into something else, until we start seeing enough investment in these technologies to make them viable and to see a lot of return on it. Otherwise, we're sort of stuck with this very slow development of them.
Well, an alternative option, there's some folks in the space elevator community that feel like a partnership between perhaps India, Indonesia, and a Middle Eastern wealthy nation like the United Arab Emirates, that combination of brain power, access location, and could complete and any efforts by any American team, because we have a very restrictive forward. Whereas if you had near limitless capital and near limitless, you could just sidestep everybody and just go a more direct route.
Right.
I think if you focus on space-based solar power and that the elevator becomes the catalyst for space-based solar power, an energy company could just step in and start doing that work. And there's plenty of precedent of multi-billion-dollar, multi-decadal energy programs that have more than paid for themselves. So there's definitely some models out there other than the one I just referenced that are intriguing. So I wouldn't rule it out, but it's not just about the money. You also have to have popular consensus. You have to have a certain level of education and acceptance to the idea.
Right.
So all of those things have contributed to having this elevator vision clouded for a while. And then, of course, we went out of business in 2007. We were focused on, we'd moved away from carbon nanotubes, then got pretty good at robotics. We were focusing on the mechanical processes of climbing. And so we started doing high-altitude balloon tests. We'd gotten as high as a mile with one of our tests. It's a small robot. It's maybe only 4 feet long. It's probably pretty close to 40 pounds heavy. It's long and thin. And, it climbed. I mean, we did what we were trying to do. And then we had a different experiment that lasted for 60 days. The robot wasn't doing climbing for 60 days back and forth, but that was a altitude, long endurance. And then everything fell apart once the economy crashed. I wound up, the project was financed primarily through my real estate holdings. I had a 6-story, 40,000 square foot commercial office building. And I was using the equity and cash flow from that to keep my team going. But when the economy started crashing and real estate was one of the first casualties, we got crushed. So yeah, you started this by saying we were kind of a big deal a couple of years ago. Yeah, but it's been 8 years since we went out of business. So, I mean, at some level, we kind of had to start from scratch, and we had to accept the fact that the Earth elevator is out of reach right now. The technology isn't there, but then that was like, all right, well, what can we do? What can we actually do to move that idea forward?
Which brings us really comfortably into the next question here. I mean, we've went over history quite a bit, but the clever way you worded that, Earth elevator, kind of gives me a little bit of a hint as to what your response is going to be. But what exactly are you up to now?
Well, so about 2011, we started thinking about what can we actually do with current technology. Forget the visionary idea of the Earth elevator for a second. What can we do that's viable now with current materials, current rocketry, something that we can issue purchase orders instead of spending all the time in the lab doing experiments. And we came across the lunar elevator, and it was kind of a eureka moment. And the lunar elevator allows us to test most, not all, but most of the technologies needed for the Earth system in honestly a more benign environment than it would be for an Earth elevator. And so that's what we really started focusing on, is building a lunar elevator. Now, the mechanics of that are a little bit different. I described the Earth elevator as kind of a ball and a string. Mm. The lunar elevator is more like a teeter-totter, where you have Earth's gravity on one end and the moon's gravity on the other. Now, of course, the moon is much smaller, so the fulcrum for that teeter-totter is in a different place, right? So that point where everything balances out is called the L1, the Lagrange point, between the Earth and the moon, and that you basically have mostly nullified the effects of gravity between those two bodies. And our idea is we take, again, an extraordinarily long, strong string, but a string that is within current technology levels. We take a long, strong string, we go to the Lagrange point, we take a rocket to the Lagrange point, we drop a string down to the surface of the moon, drive a spike into the surface and stay there. We basically put a barbed system into the surface of the moon that holds us tight to the surface. We pull that string through the Lagrange point and then back towards the Earth. Now, the media somehow imply that we're going to actually stitch the Earth and the moon together by a long, strong string. I don't really understand why they keep making that mistake, because, well, the Earth spins. I don't know where they expect to anchor something from the moon to the Earth. But anyway, the media get that wrong a lot. But yeah, we're not going to be coming all the way back and touching the Earth. I promise you, we're not doing that. But we are going to pull that string far enough back past the Lagrange point towards the Earth so that it is comfortably within Earth's very long gravity well.
Right.
So the counterweight is hanging, gently being tugged back by the Earth, but it's hanging kind of in free space. But once you have that, you've once again established a railroad that you can climb back and forth, this time down to the surface of the moon. In the Earth elevator, everybody focuses on getting off the Earth. That's the hard part. On the lunar elevator, soft landing is the hard part. The reason we had a Saturn-class rocket in the first place was for one reason and one reason only. It was to get enough mass and enough fuel up so that we could soft land on the moon. And it was a pretty dicey calculation. They just barely had enough to do what they were doing. Soft landing on the moon is extraordinarily hard. That's the reason why we've been much more active about going to Mars. Landing on Mars is a cakewalk compared to landing on the moon, even though it's a whole lot further away.
Right.
The atmosphere of Mars allows you to do a lot of tricks that you can't do on the moon.
Right.
So we build the lunar elevator for soft landing on the moon. That's really the key. And that technology is completely within our capacity right now. There's about a dozen candidate materials for the string, thanks to what NASA and SpaceX are doing for heavy lift rocket capacity, thanks to Bigelow Aerospace putting together a viable space station option that could sit at the Lagrange point. That technology and all the technologies for anchoring and the robotics, all of that stuff is basically available now. So it's much less a question of R&D. There's absolutely R&D there,
right.
But it's less of a requirement for breakthroughs and more of a requirement to do systems of systems development.
Right. And so what exactly, I mean, you're talking about the soft landing element of it, and obviously the space elevator in and of itself is just going to be, different than the Earth one, but what exactly, like, are there any specific technologies that are going to be changing there? You're talking about the materials being more available, so I'm assuming that it doesn't require carbon nanotubes like the Earthbound elevator sort of kind of does.
Right.
Is there anything else in there that's sort of unique and different to the lunar one compared to the Earth one? Because I think a lot of people just assume that it's essentially the same thing, just a couple million miles away.
Yeah, it's much smaller. The lunar elevator is much smaller by our current design. It's so much cheaper. We anticipate something around $800 million to build the mechanical version, and probably another $400 million to build a human-rated system, a crewed version, versus north of $20 billion for an Earth elevator. So, I mean, that's a pretty big difference. But the lunar system is much smaller. The Earth system was designed at about 100 tons once a week. The lunar system is only about 2,000 kilos, so 2 tons. And that's probably every 2 weeks. It might be every 4 weeks. So the throughput is very different. We look at that as more like like the Antarctic Research Station. What was extraordinarily challenging in the beginning has now become a thriving city of almost 5,000 people, 4,000 people most of the year long. So I don't want to say it's less ambitious, because it's pretty darn ambitious, but it's easier to do, it's cheaper to do, it's within realm of what's currently possible technologically. And the robotics are I won't say well understood, but conceptually we have a pretty good handle on it. Liam, I'm actually I'm teaching a 15-hour lecture series later this summer, and one of the things that we're going to get out of it is what we refer to as the 1,000 questions problem. Obviously, the number 1,000 is an arbitrary number, but it's an acknowledgement that we don't even have all the questions yet today, let alone have all the answers.
Right, and I mean, that's, again, we keep bringing this back. That's just such that's such a common problem with a lot of these technologies, that we're not even asking all of the questions yet. Right.
So what we're going to do this summer is actually try to identify what those questions are. And of course, everybody's going to start talking about the technology, because that's what everybody always talks about. But there's problems in law and international treaty. There's military ethics questions. There's mineral rights questions, because we plan on doing some mining on the moon. There's the technology behind robotics and computing and material sciences and energy systems and capacitors and batteries. There's communications. Interestingly to me, there's theological questions. There's social implications. So we're going to try and tackle. We're not going to try to answer anything at this stage. Nobody is certain about any answers.
Right.
What we're going to try and identify is core questions that need answers so we can move forward.
Right.
So I'm very excited about that. That's going to be really great.
Yeah, it's going to be fantastic. Is there any way for sort of people listening to get involved with that?
The project's called Copernicus. It's run by a group called Exosphere. Exosphere is primarily European, but a little bit in Latin America. The website is copernicus.exosphere, but it's not a typical .com. It's EXOSPHRE.RE. Copernicus.exosphere. And it's .re at the end of Exosphere.
I'll post a link with a description of the episode for everyone to check it out. That's
Sure.
really interesting stuff.
The class is full. Actually, they're oversubscribed. They've had over 150 applicants. They only have 33 slots.
Whew.
So there's talk about doing a second one, and there's talk about doing it online, making it available online.
Yeah.
I'm not involved with any of the planning or production of any of that. I'm just there as a advisor. But what's interesting is they start out, the core of the class, it's almost a 3-week class, 2.5 weeks long. The core of the class is about Earth's elevator as not as a science project, but as a tool to help understand how science and philosophy and economics and politics all blur together. I thought that was really interesting. They wanted me to talk about the Earth elevator, and I said I could, but I didn't want to because I didn't think that I didn't think they had the right approach to their Earth system. But I'd be happy to talk about the lunar system. So they've asked me to come in and put together, it's 12 hours of class time and then 3 hours worth of workshop. And so throughout that workshop, we'll be doing a lot of questions, identifying questions.
Right. That's fascinating stuff. It's probably right up the alley of anyone listening at home.
Well, I hope so. I mean, to me, bringing this all back to space settlement, I mean, the reason I was always interested first in the Earth elevator and second in the lunar elevator was I feel like it is a catalytic tool that allows for everything else that everybody wants to do, whether that's interstellar travel, settlement on Mars, asteroid mining, my personal favorite, space-based solar power, providing clean, green, limitless energy to everyone, everywhere. Those kinds of things allow us to move humanity to the stars.
Right.
But it also allows us to solve many of our resource problems. I mean, I personally believe that for the last 20 years, we've been experiencing a series of resource wars, and that we're going to continue to do that. So if we can bring resources from outside our very, very tiny envelope here, it changes everything. So to me, the elevator is the key to that, whether it's the Earth system or the first precursor of the lunar system. I think that opens up every other door that we want to open.
Right. Which, I mean, I don't disagree with that, at least in principle. I mean, a lot of why I'm interested in space settlement is for similar reasons. We need some way of enabling a lot of these technologies.
What's amazing to me is what I'm about to say is a heretical statement that'll be considered blasphemy by my other space elevator colleagues, that if reusable first stages become common and real, I mean, SpaceX is pioneering it, but ULA and Blue Origin are right behind them, and Europeans are looking at it too. If that becomes the way that things happen in the near future, it may take the Earth elevator off the table entirely.
Right.
There are people that think that reusable first stages can get prices down from, historical averages of $5,000 to $20,000 to GEO down to $2,000, $3,000 to GEO. That's price competitive to the mythical space elevator.
Right. Yeah, that's
right?
Insane.
So I feel like I've kind of come full circle saying, all right, my goal in doing all this in the first place was mass transit to space, not a few people with the right stuff, but moving humanity to the stars, unleashing humanity from the tyranny of gravity, and it looks like a reusable rocket system might do some of that. I don't know if those numbers are real, but if you can bring that kind of reusability to the table, I think that makes it. I think that makes the case for the lunar elevator, and hold your thoughts, a Martian elevator even more likely. I think there's definitely a place in the solar system for those two elevators. I am not 100% sure. I'm a high 90%. I mean, I haven't switched. I haven't switched on that, but I'm 100% sure that there's a place for a lunar elevator and a Martian elevator. I am only 90% sure that there's a place for an Earth elevator now.
Well, let me ask you one question before we have to wrap up for the evening. Talked a little bit about the past. Talked a little bit about what you guys are up to right now. Where do you see Liftport going in the next 10 years?
Well, to the moon. We have a pretty detailed roadmap, technology development roadmap. First, we do a couple. We have a couple more high altitude balloon experiments that we have to do using robots to climb back and forth. Part of that is the Kickstarter obligation, and part of that is the original experiments that we did. We built 18 robots and 14 high altitude experiments. Those were based off of the design we needed for the Earth elevator. Because we switched gears to the lunar elevator, there's some pieces there that we don't really know and don't really understand. And so the design for a lunar elevator is different enough to have to force us to do redesigns for some of the mechanical processes of climbing. And that's proven to be surprisingly challenging. But that's the short term. We'll tackle some high altitude experiments. I was talking to some folks in Europe about that just yesterday. I don't know if that's going to happen or not. And then we have a series of string experiments in space. We've proposed and been turned down 3 times. We've proposed some stuff to go to the International Space Station. We have some CubeSats and SmallSat experiments we'd like to do that lengthen string and deploy string out in space. There's definitely some work that needs to be done there. And then ultimately, set up shop, develop a space station at the Lagrange point, and drop our string into the surface of the moon. That's what the next 10 years looks like.
Easy goals then. So
Easy.
to set attainable stuff.
Oh, sure, right. Oh, super easy. We should have I think we should have had the first private done by Thursday, and
Yeah,
then
right.
there, yeah, no,
Maybe
I'm
15 we can get one of those Pluto elevators going. You know, why not?
probably not. No, no. We've been looking at some of the asteroid wrangling ideas that are out there. We think that that's pretty intriguing. I think if I were to bet, I would say asteroid mining is further away than a lunar elevator, but they're both really challenging.
Right.
You know, I think that there's some interesting breakthroughs that are going to be happening on space settlement from the perspective of artificial gravity developments. That, I mean, people don't have any idea whether or not they can sustain in space long term.
Right.
I mean, it's shocking to me that we're making all of these big plans. We have no idea whether a human body can sustain that environment,
Right.
permanently or indefinitely.
There were plans for a rotating module in the ISS to sort of test that, but it was canceled.
Yeah, I was involved with some of the folks at the University of Washington here and at MIT that were developing a simulator for mice. A very, very small satellite that would just rotate and see if the mice could live and, more importantly, reproduce in that environment. That plan got pretty far and then ultimately stopped. So I'm not sure why it stopped, but I haven't heard anything from it in the last couple of years.
Right.
I mean, there's been plans for a while now to do stuff, but until we've done it, they're just paper plans. You know,
It's all goes back to that whole octopus of questions and problems that stop us getting anywhere.
Yep, exactly. You know, well, one last thing before we close up. You'd asked kind of what Liftport's doing. The big idea is of course the driver, right? That's the thing that organizes our research plan. But the reality is that you have to pay for this. And so we kind of got sick of begging for scraps, as I call it, and decided that this year really is about the commercialization of our technologies. So we have 3 subsidiaries that we're in the process of creating. Each one does down-to-earth stuff, right? We have a new metal that we think is pretty intriguing. We probably won't be doing a lot of work on that this year. What we're doing first and second is a communications and observations company using robotics and comms, and we're building a media company. So the idea is that those 2 things, and then the third one being metals late next year, will drive enough revenue so that we can be self-sufficient. We have never been self-sufficient, and I think that that's probably the biggest mistake we've ever made. Under NASA's watch, we were entirely dependent on proposals that ultimately got turned down. When we were in the Liftport 1.0 days, we were mostly dependent on my own personal checkbook. We did have some angels in there, but it was mostly out of my own resources. And when those resources ended, the company collapsed. And then whether it's philanthropists or Kickstarter backers, you're still begging for something, and we're not able to stand on our own 2 feet. So that's really the emphasis for this year and next year, is just to develop a sustainable, even if it's modest, a sustainable revenue stream that then can feed back to the main parent company. So that's, you don't hear a lot of people talking about the business of this technology, but there is a solid business plan, and there's interesting technology that's going to be spun out of it. And so we've actually started referring to ourselves as an idea factory, where we create ideas, spin out intellectual property, commercialize that, generate revenues, and that feeds the machine of our community of technical advisors.
And I'd like to spend an entire episode talking about the business side of technologies like this, because I really think that is a fascinating element of this world that never quite gets brought out into the light as often as I'd like.
Well, I mean, we're definitely breaking the model. The traditional model is either government research, grants, university research. It's paid for by industry. The idea of being self-funded, self-financed is pretty unique. And the idea of spinning out technologies, every university, that's one of the hallmarks of both MIT and Georgia Tech and Rice and Stanford. I mean, that's what they do, is they are an idea factory. They spin out interesting intellectual property, commercialize it as they can. Not everything works, not everything wins in the marketplace. But those folks have built huge systems by commercializing their technology. Right. So what if we just used our elevator as the glue for that big idea? So that's really, I mean, that's been my primary focus. I haven't done research on the elevator in probably 6 months, maybe 9 months. Last summer was when we were working on an experiment that didn't work. And so at that point, we're like, what are we going to do next? Because what we're doing now isn't working. And so that's really the transition that we've done.
Michael, you've been wonderful. It's been a fantastic chat.
Thanks.
It's been really interesting. Even to a skeptic like myself for the space elevator stuff, I think you're bringing a lot of interesting thoughts to the table about this.
I'm curious, where do you stand on the skepticism? I mean, I admitted myself on the Earth elevator, but where do you stand on the lunar elevator? And no pressure. I'm just curious.
It's not something I've spent a great deal of time looking into myself. I'll admit that straight up.
Okay.
Especially for lunar elevators, I've had 1 or 2 run-ins with some people who are working on it, and some chats with them. And I mean, it's sort of similar to Earth elevator right now in my mind. It's an interesting idea. It's interesting stuff going on there, and certainly lunar gives it some advantages that Earth just straight up doesn't.
Right.
But there's still those barriers, and talking to you, I'm convinced that someone someday is going to get around those barriers, but I'm not sure when it's going to happen yet.
Fair enough. Okay.
All right.
Hey, cool. Great chatting with you. If you want to talk about the business of this stuff someday, I'm happy to do that too.
I think that'd be fantastic.
Okay.
See you now.
Take care.
Hey, if you like what we do here and you want to hear more experts from all sorts of fields talking about space settlement in ways that you might not hear anywhere else, consider donating to our Patreon account. We really rely on donations to keep the show going, and even a small donation helps us get better guests, better equipment, and produce a better show for you. We have some great goals in mind for the show, and we'd really like you to make something special. You can check out our link to our Patreon account on the website, or in the comments or links that accompany this show. Thanks! If you have any comments or suggestions for the show, please email me at voicesfroml5@gmail.com, or leave a comment. Music for Voices from L5 has been graciously provided by John Boswell of Symphony of Science. Find more of his work at www.symphonyofscience.com.